sort of do a recap on what we have covered so far. So the module is Principles of Economics, and we focused more on microeconomic aspects. And we discussed what is meant by the term economics, and we talked about why economics is a scientific study, because it's a social science and it uses scientific techniques to study human decision-making behavior in the face of human decision-making behavior in the face of scarce resources, right? Or by definition, it's how individuals and societies make decisions about ways to use scarce resources to fulfill wants and needs. And then we talked about the two broad disciplines of economics, micro and macro. So micro is a study of small entities in the economy, households and firms, and macroeconomics is the study of the bigger picture, right? For example, we looked at the individual decision-making behavior of the consumers and the producers, and both these entities, when the products, goods and services come into the market, we'll talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand, growth, unemployment, exchange, and if there's another party involved, like the international community, then we talk about exchange rates, deficits. And so all those macroeconomic variables are discussed under macroeconomics, and GDP and so on. Then, yeah. And then we talked about the three economic questions: what, how, and for whom to produce goods and services, and scarcity. And we saw that the scarcity leads to a trade-off, because if there are several options, and if you can go for only one option because of scarcity, that is called trade-off. And trade-off leads to another very important concept in economics, and we call that opportunity cost. Right? It's a cost of the next best choice, the next best alternative. It's actually the cost of the foregone benefit. Right? If you have two options, if you pick one, the cost of the foregone benefit, or the benefit that you have to give up. Then the four factors of production in economics: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And using these factors of production, firms or the economy produces goods and services which are consumed by the consumers. And depending on who owns these factors of production and who answers these three key questions, there are the economic systems in the world. And we looked at four key economic systems: the traditional economy, then the command economy, which is one extreme, and the capitalist economy, and the mixed economy, which you will see characteristics of both the command economy and the capitalistic economy, or the market economy. Right? And we looked at Karl Marx very briefly, because he is one of the greatest economists, and his book Das Kapital led to a lot of revolutions, which were focused on moving from capitalistic economies towards socialism and ultimately communism. Right? And then Adam Smith is father of economics, and he wrote the book called The Wealth of Nations, which talked about how the government should stay out of business and let the market forces, the demand and supply forces, determine the price in the market. So that's sort of the gist of the theory. Then we looked at the two entities in the market, two key entities: the demand, or the consumers side, and the producer side. So under demand theory, we looked at factors affecting demand, and we said that we could, if you really want to model the demand or estimate the demand for a particular good, then you can do that by using a demand function. So it's a mathematical model. You collect data and estimate this function to understand the impact of the variables or factors that affect demand and the magnitude, by how much, right? And demand schedule, we saw that price quantity is a negative relationship for normal goods. When price increases, quantity decreases. But at the same time, there are other types of goods which we didn't discuss, like giffen goods or luxury goods, where as price increase, demand could increase, but for a normal good, we say there's a negative relationship. So, and we also wanted to see why humans, or why we pay less as the price increases. And to understand that, we looked at utility. So utility, there are two schools of thought: cardinal utility and ordinal utility. Cardinal, we said that we could assign a number called utils, the unit, and measure the relative utility, or you could order the utility and estimate the utility of a good or a service. And to understand that better, we discussed an example where we had a numerical example where we were looking at what happened to utility as you consume good 1 unit at a time. And we looked at total utility of consumption and the marginal utility. So marginal, the term marginal is very important because it looks at the additional utility that you get as you increase the consumption of 1 extra unit, the product. And this is the total utility, marginal utility figure. And you can see when the total utility is at its maximum, this peak point there, the marginal utility is 0. So totally, the marginal utility actually is the change in the total utility to a change in the number of glasses or change in the quantity. So therefore, the slope of the total utility is marginal utility, or in other words, marginal utility is the slope of the total utility function. Right? And then we wanted to derive the demand curve from the utility curve. And we saw that if something is given free, then the consumer can go up to its maximum total satisfaction or utility, right? This point here. Yeah. Otherwise, the time, that's when it's free, but if it's priced, then to find that point mathematically or algebraically, we would use this function called marginal utility equals the unit price of that product. So that we could see as the price increases, the point that we can maximize our satisfaction will move down. Therefore, we could derive the function where as price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. So that was the demand curve, right? And then there's a law underpinning that theory. It's called the utility gain from, it's called law of diminishing marginal utility, which means that as you consume more and more units of a product, the marginal or the additional utility will gradually reduce, right? Right, that was when you consume one product. Now, what would happen if you consume 2 products at a time? We could denote that or show that using an indifference curve. Why is it called an indifference curve? Because it shows bundles, commodity bundles, commodity bundles. That gives you the same level of utility, can it? Combination, bundle, the products like Actena, bread and rice consume Kanana. If, no matter what, or irrespective of what you consume, the bundles that you consume, you will get the same level of utility if you are on this line, or if you're on this curve. It's called indifference curve, meaning you are indifferent. There's no difference of the utility. Whichever you consume, this one and this one, any of the bundles, you will still get the same level of utility. So as a consumer, you would want to push this curve up and increase your satisfaction or utility as a rational consumer. But the problem is we are constrained by 2 key things. One is our budget, and the other is market prices. So we wanted to include those constraints and our wishes together. We have wishes, which is shown by the indifference curve. This is how much we want to eat or consume. This is our budget line. And if you put both those two together, our wishes and the budget, then we can find the optimum point of consumption. And we saw that at this point, the two curves are tangent to each other, and we know that algebraically, mathematically, when two curves or two lines are tangent to each other, the slope of these curves equate, right? So the slope of this curve, which is the marginal rate of substitution, equals price ratio. So price of bread and price of rice. Right, and then we looked at how factors affect the demand, different factors. Its own price will change along the demand curve. So this might be an MCQ question, for example. If its own price changes, the average price it changes along the demand curve. All other factors are called demand shifters. For example, cross prices, substitute prices, complement prices, these things change. It will shift the demand curve. All that. And then we looked at income. Depending on how much you spend on consuming goods and services, they are categorized into three types: inferior, normal, and luxury. If your demand increases if your demand decreases as your income increases, then that type of goods are called inferior. The others could be normal or luxury goods. Then elasticity of demand is very important to understand the quantity or quantify the relationship between the factors or the demand determinants and the quantity demanded, right? So we did a few calculations to see how responsive our demand is when certain factors change. For example, if with age does demand change? When your price increases, how much of an impact does that have on the quantity demanded? Right? Income 10% really value quantity demanded kocharaking aduveda. Right? So we could do that using elasticity formula. And then we looked at the producer side, the supply side. Right? So the theory is very similar. There are factors that affect supply, right? But for a consumer, the ultimate objective is to maximize utility, right? So you would want the prices to reduce as much as possible, whereas the suppliers would want the prices to increase. So these two forces in the market will determine the price in an ideal market without any artificial intervention. Right? Supply, they would want to, they like it if the prices increase. So there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And we could model this relationship also using a supply function, just like a demand function. And you can use statistical models, statistical packages, run this model and estimate the supply. Right? So this is a supply curve. Same axis, price and quantity. But here we see a positive relationship. Again, except for its own price, eigenprice karende, any other factor will shift the supply curve, right, in the short run. Right, then the market equilibrium, price and quantity, right? We saw what could happen if prices increase. There will be excess supply. If prices decrease, there will be a shortage. And we looked at the tax, how a tax would affect the equilibrium, price and quantity. Then we looked at theory of firm, or what happens inside a firm, and how decisions are made in a little more detail. Now, this is the first one is factor-product relationship. Under factor-product relationship, we looked at the production function. We saw how we could model the factors affecting quantity. And we can also estimate the magnitude or the size of the impact, right? Numerically, we can do that using numbers. If you collect data for these factors, like on the left-hand side, you find the output or the yield. On the right-hand side, you have several variables that affect quantity, right? And then you model that. If you take one factor at a time, one input and one output, we will see this type of a typical graph for biological relationships like crops and livestock or aquaculture production. And then we looked at a numerical example where we could derive the total product, and from that we could find the marginal product and the average product. Now these are important because to make decisions, we would want to find, for example, if you're looking at efficiency of a farm, right? If you want to estimate efficiency of a farm, you would want to find the efficiency parameters like the average product, for example, right? Labor again, product unit input output, right? So there are certain packages to estimate the relationships, like tailor-made packages or customized packages to estimate efficiency. And using those, you can find efficiency of farms. You can even compare them. You could, simulate and see what would happen if you increase the inputs by this much. What would happen if the climate change factors change, climatic factors change. So those things also can be done. Then you find the marginal and average product. And this is a typical generic graph, but just to understand the theory behind this. And so you can see that the total product will increase as you increase the fertilizer level. Total product increases, comes to a maximum, and then decreases. The average and the marginal products will also increase and reaches a maximum, and then they become, they decrease with addition of more inputs. But you can see here again, if things are given free, if fertilizer or any input labor or whatever is free, then the producer can easily move up to the maximum yield. But if it's priced, then you have to come up, decide on an optimum point. We did that by using this function. The price of fertilizer equals marginal product times price of output, right? Times, this is cross times. And when you do that, you can see as prices change, this point will shift, right? So prices will determine the optimum amount to use and also the corresponding optimum yield that you will get. Because these are the constraints that the producer will face, isn't it? So this is the input price. This is the input price, and this is the output price. Then factor-factor relationship. So under factor-factor relationship, it's very similar to the indifference curve, isn't it? Because there we looked at the consumption of two products and The consumption of two products, in the indifference curve showed us the consumption of two products that gives us the same, or that gives the same level of utility. But here we're looking at the use of two inputs that would give us the same level of quantity or output. So it's called an isoquant, or same quantity or same output curve. So this is what you see here is an isoquant that gives you the same level of output using different level inputs. What level selling input combinations use කරත් එකම output එකක් ලැබෙනවා නම් ඒකට අපි කියනවා isoquant කියලා. Right, isoquant. So this one is called isoquant, and if you plot several on the same graph, it's called an isoquant map. Right. So just like a consumer, a producer, but because for a producer, the ultimate objective is to maximize profit, right? So the producer would also want to push the quantity or production up as much as possible, but he too is constrained by two constraints. One is the budget and the other are input prices. So we could model that constraint because we know the wishes. අපේ wish එක තමයි producer කෙනෙක් විදිහට increase the output. අපේ constraint, they are the budget and the prices. So if you put both the constraints and the wishes on the same graph, then we are able to find the cost minimizing input bundles. So why cost minimizing? Because to maximize profit, you would want to maximize revenue and minimize cost. And since we are talking about inputs, we are looking at cost minimizing input bundles. Right. Then the third relationship was product-product relationship. Like I said, it's a very important concept in economics. And this shows us what? Said that this curve shows us the most efficient products. If you produce more than one product in your firm or in the economy, and whatever is inside will be, you can still produce them, but not efficient. So as a country or as a firm, you would want to meet or push your production up until this efficient point. And this point there, the red dot, is not achievable given the current resources, because we draw this graph assuming that the technology is fixed. Your resource endowment or resources, or the resources that you have in the country or with the firm are fixed, right? And given those resources and current technology, these are the efficient points. But if you can improve your technology, if you can improve your resources, get more land, train your labor, and if you can, you will be able to push this forward and reach a higher level of production and efficiency. Right, so we discussed that. And then we looked at the theory of cost, which is very important for a lot of decisions, like to find cost minimizing, input bundles, output bundles. Then in your pricing strategies, you would have heard of average cost pricing, marginal cost pricing, cost plus pricing. So to make decisions in terms of pricing, it's important to understand the cost. So we looked at two types of costs, variable and fixed costs. And we said in the short run of a firm, you find both the fixed cost and a variable cost. Variable cost will vary with the output. Now, this is the output. Our cost of the firm will vary. Now, F stands for function, meaning it varies with cost. The cost of the firm varies with the level of output, right? So if it depends on the output, that is called variable cost. And if it does not depend on the output, that is called a fixed cost, right? So in the short run, there are variable inputs and fixed inputs. Therefore, we see both types of costs in the short run, but in the long run, we say all inputs become variable. Therefore, in the long run, you will only find variable inputs, right? So total cost is a function of the total fixed cost and the total variable cost. Right? So if I draw this on a graph, you can see that the variable cost depends on the output. For example, if I want to produce more of a crop, I will have to use more fertilizer. Now, fertilizer ප්‍රමාණය වැඩි කරන්න වෙනවා, crop එක වැඩි කරන්න ඕන. Now, මගේ cost එක ඒ crop එක මත dependent, output එක මත dependent. So that is called a fixed cost, variable cost. But the fixed cost will not vary with the output. Right? For example, I maybe have just one machine and I can't buy more machines in that season harvest or whatever. So that will not depend on the level of output. So that cost is fixed no matter how much output you increase, your fixed cost will be fixed. So fixed make එකතුව fixed cost plus variable cost එකතුව තමයි total cost, right? So that's what you see here. So therefore this difference is the fixed cost. Right, so what do you see here? Now average, we could derive different types of costs using the total cost function, because we know the total cost depends on the level of output. Output of Q at the output. This is Q. Q must depend on variable cost, fixed cost, marginal average variable cost, average fixed cost, average total cost, and marginal cost could be derived from this total cost. Right? So last week using these numbers. Right. So what else can we see here? Now a firm is interested in, of course, pricing the product so that you can maximize your profit. So if you want to maximize profit and if you want to price your product, the unit price of a product will have to be less than more than the cost, isn't it? The price that you sell the product at, price of the product should be greater than the unit price or unit cost of that product. The firm will price the product above this point. Above this point, doesn't it? Price එක හැම වෙලේම මේ average cost එක minimum වෙන point එකනේ මේක. එහෙනම් ඊට වඩා price එක වැඩි වෙන්න ඕනේ හැම වෙලේම product. Okay? So if you එකක price එක ගත්තොත්, right? At this price, this firm can sell this amount of quantity. So if you plot this on a graph with price on this axis and Q on this axis, the marginal cost curve will reflect the supply curve of the firm, right? So now we are familiar with supply curve because in the very first lecture we looked at supply curve, and this is the marginal cost reflects the supply curve. It's actually an inverse relationship, but we could say that sort of reflects the supply curve of the firm, right? So that's why it's important to derive these functions using the total cost. And when you do, also look at how pricing strategies, costs will vary in certain market structures. So we looked at 4 types of market structures. On one extreme, we looked at perfect competition, or we call it perfectly competitive market. So the name itself gives us a clue that it's perfectly competitive, right? There are price takers. There are so many competitors, or there are so many sellers in the industry that nobody can decide. I mean, you can decide, but if you vary the price, then you will have to suffer consequences and you will not get the same profits, because in this type of a market, we say that you cannot make abnormal or supernormal profits. So in a perfect competition, the market will decide, the industry decides as a group that you will have to sell your product at the same price. Right. Then we looked at the other side, at the other end of the spectrum, the continuum, where you find monopoly has the highest market power. Why does it have highest market power? And මේ type perfect competition market එක තමයි අඩුම market power එකක් තියෙන්නේ, වැඩිම market power තියෙන්නේ monopoly. Why? Monopoly, there's only one firm, right? If you're the only firm, then you can do whatever you want with your products and pricing, right? As long as people are willing to pay for your product, you can vary your price as you wish. Then we looked at monopolistic competition, where there is a lot of, lots of sellers in the market, but not as many as in a perfectly competitive market. There's still competition, but because there are lots of substitutes, so the market could be quite inelastic because there are lots of substitutes. Quite elastic, but it can kind of therefore, rather than price competition, they compete with non-price competitive strategies like buy one get one free, or giving a better service, promoting their product, better advertising tactics. Those things you can see a lot in this type of market. Okay, now where will you then price the product? That we discussed, or how will they decide on how much to produce to maximize their profit? We say that a firm would maximize the profit where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. එකකින් වැඩිපුර ලැබෙන revenue එක ඒ වැඩිපුර produce කරන එකකට යන cost එකට සමාන වෙන තැනදී marginal revenue. Okay, marginal total revenue you can find by multiplying price of what the product එකක මිල quantity එක වැඩි කරලා අපිට total revenue එක හොයාගන්න පුළුවන්. මේක පස්සේ අපිට මේකෙන් marginal revenue හොයාගන්න පුළුවන්, just like we did in the cost function. Total cost එකෙන් අපිට marginal cost එක හොයාගත්තා වගේ. You equate these two and then you will find the optimum quantity to produce. ඊට පස්සේ අපි දැක්කා කොහොමද ඒක demand curve එකට line එක extend කරලා price එක decide කරන්න කියලා. Right? So that theory can be applied to all other imperfectly competitive markets. Perfect competitive market එක අපි first කතා කරපු market එක හැරෙන්න, all other types of markets are imperfectly competitive markets, right? There's no perfect competition, they are imperfect competitive. Okay. Then we looked at oligopoly. We said that these types of market, in this type of a market, you find few firms, but they're relatively large sellers with high market share, and so you might see things like collusion, price fixing in this type of market. Again, optimum product found or profit maximization happens where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And this is actually a summary of the structures. So if you want to explain the nature of an industry or characteristics of an industry, you will look at the number of firms, the freedom to enter and exit, nature of the product, whether it's homogeneous, differentiated, what type. Like in the case of an oligopoly, you would see a lot of, firms would look at what others do. There's rivalry in that type of markets. So, and it's very easy to enter a perfect competitive market, and then thereafter the restrictions increase. And we saw that the shape of the demand curve, which is actually kinked, not a straight demand curve, but a kinked demand curve, because the shape depends on the driver, or they look at what others do, and accordingly they will price their products. Right. So in an imperfectly competitive market, like in a monopoly, for example, where the company or the firm can, the business can determine or vary the price as they wish, you will see what we call as price discrimination, right? So you will come across this term in other modules related to marketing, for example. So price discrimination is the act of charging different prices to different consumers in order to capture consumer surplus, isn't it? So we looked at consumer surplus in the first day. Like, for example, there's a market price. This is the demand for a product. Let's say this is any product. Yeah. And there's, let's say now this is the demand for mango, and there's a market price for mango, right? This is the market price, is how much you pay. So you can see the consumers, some consumers are willing to pay this much. Demand function එකෙන් අපිට පෙන්නන්නේ එක quantities වලට කොච්චර pay කරන්න කැමතිද එහෙනම් මේ quantity එකට people are willing to pay this much, right? But the market price is actually this amount. Then මේ quantity එක අපි ගත්තොත් people are willing to pay, let's say, 100 rupees, but the market price would be 50, right? So you can see people are willing to pay more for this product, but people actually pay less, right, in the market. එහෙමනම් price discrimination, right? So there's a request to explain the columns of that table. Let's very quickly go through that again. So we said last week that we can characterize a market using these characteristics. When you categorize a market or an industry, rather, we look at these characteristics. First one is number of firms. How many firms are there? For example, if we take perfect competition, we know there are so many, hundreds, thousands or more people in a market. That type of market is a perfect competitive market, a perfectly competitive market. So if there's only one, it's a monopoly. Now, number of firms, how many firms are there in this type of market? So accordingly, we can decide which type of a market it is, right? If you take the dairy industry or the fresh milk industry, that would fall under perfect competition because there are so many sellers in that market, right? But if you take something like petroleum or gas in Sri Lanka, what type of a market will that fall into? So you look at how many firms are there in the market. So if it's 2, 3 or 4 or 5, accordingly. If it's 2, you can categorize under oligopoly, but it's also called a duopoly. So that would fall under this market structure. Then freedom to enter. Freedom of entry, meaning we said that it's very difficult to enter certain types of markets for different reasons, like sometimes the cost of production or the principal investment could be very, very high, like in the airline industry. It's very difficult to enter, or it's impossible to enter this type of a market. For example, pure monopoly. Okay, it could be that either the investment is very high, the principal cost is very, very high, or it could be that it is based on some technical monopoly. Patent එකක් තියෙන pharmaceutical company එකක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. Copyrights තියෙන හින්දා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. Software producing company එකක් නම්. So restrictions are there. අපි කැමති කෙනෙකුට enter වෙන්න බෑ. So that's a monopoly. So take a spectrum එකක් continuum එකක් කියලා කිව්වා. දැන් ඒකෙන් restrictions අඩු වෙගෙන යන උඩට යනකොට දැන් perfect competition එක easily anyone can enter and also exit, right? Restrictions අඩුයි ඒක නිසා කැමති ලාවක යන්න එන්න පුළුවන් කියන එක තමයි මේකෙන් කියන්නේ. Then there's a lot of transparent information. I mean, if there's transparent information, like in the case of the dairy industry, you can get pricing on production, information on production of dairy products. You can easily find sellers and buyers. You can easily find prices. So information is also quite transparent, but as you move down, the transparency reduces. They are less and less transparent. Like for example, monopoly, more restricted, less transparent, and pure money, monopoly, I mean, very, very restricted. You might not have any information on production, maybe, right? So, nature of product, homogeneous, differentiated, undifferentiated to unique products. We know that in a perfectly competitive market, you find very homogeneous products. We take paddy, very homogeneous, isn't it? I mean, there are different varieties and so on, but more or less homogeneous, substitutable. Therefore, but as you move up down to monopoly, there's only one product and that's unique. There are no substitutes usually. So it's a monopoly. Visual firm is horizontal because it's a price taker. Whatever is decided by the industry sellers like a decide kind of market taker, sellers and buyers. That price may price taker may market taker sell karana. So horizontal. The rest of the demand curves are downward sloping, like a typical demand curve, but only in the case of an oligopoly, you will see a kink demand curve, right? We discussed this last week, so it's all there in the recording and the slides. Right, so we were talking about price discrimination. Now, so these imperfectly competitive markets are looking to discriminate price because they want to capture the consumer surplus, right? Like I said, there's a market price, but they know that people might be willing to pay more for that product, so they want to capture. So accordingly, there are 3 types of discriminatory categories. First is first degree, then second and third degree. So what do we mean by first degree price discrimination? Here, these firms are trying to capture maximum willingness to pay, right? For example, you would see this in an auction, right? You start with the lowest bid, like let's say 100 rupees, and then there's a buyer for that, or there could be several, or then they do go up to about 150, 200. Likewise, you know how an auction works, right? Bids work. So you increase the bids because there are people who are willing to pay more, but for the same good. There may එකම good එකට තමයි වැඩිපුර prices කැමති වෙන්නේ, you know. You take the bid up because people are willing to pay that price. You know, එකම quantity, එකම good එකට people are paying more. So that's discrimination, isn't it? So you can capture the highest amount that they are willing to pay. Now you will see this in online marketing, online purchasing also. You create an account and you keep doing this for you keep ordering online or purchasing online for a long time, then your purchasing behavior can be monitored by the firm, and then they know that you are willing to pay more for this product. So you will keep getting offers, nudging to purchase in that range, right? So that is called first stage price discrimination. Same product, but if somebody is willing to pay more, then they are trying to capture that surplus the consumers are willing to pay. Second degree is called excess capacity pricing. So can you think of any examples? So it says excess capacity pricing, it's based on quantity. For example, selling at a discount price after a certain number of goods are purchased. So you might say this, if I take an example, the airline industry, right, or the movie tickets or theater tickets. Right, for example, let's say the economy class, and all the tickets, if you pay in advance, then you might buy at a cheaper price. And as you get closer to the departure date, if there are still seats remaining, then the prices will go up, right? So it works both ways, actually. You will see both types of discrimination, first and second degree at times. Sometimes if you pay early, you might have a higher price. So depending on the demand, towards the date of the departure, the prices might even go down. So in that case, the people who buy closer to the departure date might pay less, right? So, but the same seat, right? The only thing is you might not be able to choose where to sit or to get a better seating location with leg space and all that, but you're paying the same amount, different amount for the same good, same seat. It's economy class, same service, but you're paying a different price. So that's called discrimination, right? Because that happened because there's excess capacity, isn't it? Excess capacity. So they would either put the price up or down if there's more seats available, because they still want to cover the fixed cost, isn't it? So third degree price discrimination is so same product, but different segments of the society pay different prices. For example, you would say, senior citizens and students paying less for certain products, and the others pay a normal price, like train tickets or bus passes, or deals in restaurants. You would see, like, students get certain offers, but the same product you pay less. So one group pays less than the other. So that's again discrimination. You're discriminating among different segments in the society, right? And you see peak and off-peak discrimination, isn't it? Same product, but for example, if you take the train tickets, so there are two. So you get peak time tickets and off-peak. So in the morning until from 7 to 9 is peak time. So the train ticket prices will be quite high. But from, let's say, 11 to 1, or after 9 to 11 or 12, it would be off-peak. So what's the difference? I mean, same seats, same class, but you're paying a different price in the morning during peak times, because they know that at that time it's if you want to get to office on the train, the company knows that you are willing to pay any price, even a higher price, for the same product, right? Because you have to get to work on the train, so they will charge the highest amount that you're willing to pay. So the prices, the train ticket prices would be high, but the same product, but different prices in the morning, but off-peak, you'll be paying less. Same happens, or same goes for internet service packages, right? Peak and off-peak times. Yeah, so that's called discrimination. So you can see this in imperfect competitive markets. Right. So that sort of covers the key theories or principles in microeconomics. And before we move to today's lecture, today we'll be looking at some applications. We will look at a few model questions that you could expect during your exam or MCQ test. Right, before that, do you have any questions? Right, so if you have any questions, we can discuss now. So here you have like 20 questions on this screen, but this is also available on LMS. I've uploaded the same document on LMS. So if you give you some time, you can log into LMS and download the document and work on it, and then we will discuss the answers. Okay. So you will, for the exam, you will get MCQ questions. Each question will have like 4 answers, and you will only have to select one, the correct answer. I will give you sufficient time to complete. The only thing is that you are only allowed one attempt. So once you start, you can't start over. You'll have to finish the exam. Otherwise, whatever is done automatically submitted, because you have done a few tests. I'm sure you are familiar with this whole setup. And yes, not sure the dates when it's going to be. So you'll have to talk to your academic coordinator. Okay, so I'll give you some time to work on this. Like I said, it's also available on LMS. Okay.